Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar. My name's Sophie. I'm a program manager in the translation team at the MRC, and I'm joined by Trinity, Deanna, Adam, and Claire, who are going to help deliver the webinar this morning. I'll go through what I plan to cover today. I'm going to start with a bit of an overview of MRC translational funding and where the proof of concept scheme fits in. And then I'll talk through in a bit more detail the purpose of MRC Proof of Concept, what it's designed to support and what's out of remit. I'll cover the assessment process, including the timelines and assessment criteria that the panel use. And then we'll go into a bit more detail about what's in a stage 1 application and provide some tips for what makes a strong proposal. And lastly, I'll cover a few kind of policy updates to make you aware of. And then at the end, we're going to have hopefully half an hour at least for Q&A. So if you could please submit your questions via the Q&A box throughout the session. And I think there will be quite a few of you online today, which is great. So if you could check if your question's already been asked and use the upvote button to help us prioritise what to answer in the Q&A panel. We'll do our best to get through as many as possible live, but if there are lots that we don't get to today, we'll prepare a kind of follow-up document to answer the ones that we don't get around to. And as a reminder, we are recording the webinar this morning and it will be shared online after the event for you to revisit or for any of your colleagues who can't be here today. So without further ado, I'll introduce the team and some of our translational research schemes. So this is the team that supports and delivers MRC Proof of Concept. It's headed by Adam Babs, who's our Associate Director of Translation, and he has oversight of all our translational research schemes and also kind of sets the strategic direction for translational research at the MRC. And then we have 7 program managers that support the scheme. Each is a lead for a specific science area or modality. And program managers can work with applicants ahead of and during assessment of proposals and also support kind of any award holders as well with post-award. At the end of this presentation, I've got a slide with all the scientific areas and contact details for the program managers, and it's also available on our website. And then the business team handle all of the application processing and funding administration and also support the peer review process, coordinate the panel meetings, and also help track our post-award processes. So that's who we are. In terms of translational research, MRC has been supporting translation for a long time, and we continue to drive a strong agenda in translational research. And we very recently set out kind of a refresh of our forward look over the medium term, so sort of identifying our vision for the next 5 to 10 years. So our vision is to establish an integrated innovation culture, driving translation for the UK. And we're not just focused on funding schemes, but also the overall ecosystem. So we ultimately want to get the best ideas further towards patient benefit and faster with the right level of ambition and risk. So we're underpinning this vision through a series of ambitions, which are to enable innovative ideas to succeed, to build a sustainable community of translational researchers in the UK, and also to embed that translational mindset early and widely. And then we've also got some cross-cutting themes, including a drive to improve the quality of proposals and projects and give them the best chance of downstream success. And we are developing a delivery plan for achieving our vision that will also incorporate kind of the new UKRI wider strategic mission and vision as well. So before I talk more about our schemes, I wanted to clarify around the naming change to DPFS and Gap Fund. This is a naming update across UKRI for any translational commercialisation funding opportunities, and the idea is to make them kind of more consistent and clearer for applicants to identify across UKRI. I want to reassure everybody that this means there's no change to the remit or the funding processes or how MRC's translational schemes operate or are assessed. So it's just a name change. It's about aligning terminologies. And it should hopefully make it easier to find and identify those translational funding opportunities across UKRI. So what's previously was known as the GAP Fund will now be called Impact Acceleration Awards, and DPFS will be known as MRC Proof of Concept. And we're already, as you know, using the updated names kind of in this webinar and going forwards. So this slide shows how our various schemes align to the translational pathway for kind of product development and intervention development. So we fund product development and translation in several different ways, depending on the stage of development and the aims of the project. So early stage support is offered by impact acceleration accounts, which are devolved awards made to research institutions to be used in a flexible way to support those early translational work. As you may know, the current IAA awards end in March next year, but MRC will be launching a new IAA funding opportunity this month for the period 2027 to 2030. So we're still continuing to support this as a way to drive those early translational projects. The Impact Accelerator Awards, as I mentioned, formerly known as GAP Fund, are designed to support single-step projects that generate critical data to support a larger funding application. So it's about de-risking with a kind of critical piece of evidence that's required to then go forward for a larger grant. MRC Proof of Concept is our main mechanism for progressing translational projects. And I'll talk more about that scheme in a second. We also offer an opportunity called the MRC and AstraZeneca High Throughput Screening Call, which is twice a year and provides funding to run a high throughput screen using AstraZeneca's compound library and screening robots. So that's about kind of providing those starting points for drug development programs. And there's a couple of schemes I've not shown on the slide that are kind of part of our wider translational funding landscape, but they have a slightly different focus. So we also have experimental medicine, and we co-fund the NIHR efficacy mechanism and evaluation schemes, and they're really supporting clinical studies, but with more of a focus on mechanism rather than that intervention product development. I just want to highlight that we don't formally use translational readiness levels or TRLs at MRC to decide whether something's in remit, but we know that lots of people do use them to sort of determine where they are on that translational pathway. So they are shown on the slide as a guide, but we don't go by that when we're kind of thinking about which scheme's most appropriate. Also important to note, we don't have any specific priorities in any disease areas or scientific areas. All of our funding activities and approaches are driven by that longer term strategy, and those schemes are designed to work together and complement each other to cover that whole pathway from kind of prototype design all the way through to early clinical trials. And as you can see on the slide, we've included the figures for the 27-28 financial year budget, and there's continuing strong investment from MRC in translational research, which is great. If you want to know about any of our other schemes, you can find more details on the MRC website. Okay, so proof of concept itself, I'll go more about into the aims of the scheme and the remit. So as I mentioned, formerly DPFS, this is our flagship translational scheme. It's been going since 2008, and it's designed really to drive innovative solutions along the development pathway towards clinical uptake and or commercialization. So it's all about de-risking novel technologies and getting them to a point where others will invest, or potentially they might be even ready for implementation. And those downstream investors could include NIHR, other public funding, or commercialization and industry investment. As you can see from the slide, we cover a wide span of the translational pathway from early prototype development all the way through preclinical development and phase 1 safety trials up to phase 2A trials. We're open to all intervention types. I've got a couple of slides on this with some examples. We do also support the development of platform technologies and tools, but only where there's a clear kind of clinical application. There's no restrictions on these projects on disease area, duration or cost. This scheme is really designed to support what's needed to meet that goal of de-risking a technology. And we do often see that it's appropriate for projects to have sequential proof of concept awards to develop that technology to that point where it can be taken forward by other funding. So you've got a couple of slides to show how broad the remit is. So these are the kind of all things that we have in our portfolio, including we have biologics, vaccines, advanced therapeutics, we fund repurposing studies, and we're seeing a growing number of digital app and AI clinical decision-making interventions in our portfolio. Since the start, we've continued to support small molecule programs and drug development programs. We also support interventions that are at the appropriate development stage that might be of benefit to the health of low middle income countries. We have a portfolio of a very wide range of medical devices and also diagnostic tools and methods, as well as imaging and radiotherapy technologies and protocols and psychological interventions. So hopefully these two slides show you that it's the very broad scope of the types of things we support. This might be more of interest, but what's out of remit? So proof of concept is not designed to support curiosity-driven or exploratory research. So if the primary aim of your project is to understand underpinning disease biology or generate new knowledge, rather than to develop an intervention towards use, then it will be considered out of remit. So if you've got a discovery research project, that's better suited to MRC's applicant-led curiosity-driven scheme or experimental medicine. Any technology being developed that doesn't yet have a clinical application is better suited to EPSRC or BBSRC schemes. We also don't fund later stage clinical studies, so phase 2B or phase 3 trials. We also don't fund work that's focused on health service delivery or health service optimization or protocol refinements. Those are all within NIHR remit rather than ours. And then another key requirement is that projects must be academically led. So this scheme's not intended to support company R&D. Sometimes that can be trickier to identify because there might be an academic as the project lead, but actually the core activity is being driven by a commercial partner. So we do assess those cases quite carefully. Borderline, most remit decisions are made by the MRC office, but if there's a borderline case, that may still be sent to the panel for review. But really a useful sense check of whether proof of concept is the right scheme for you is whether you can clearly describe where your project sits on the development pathway towards clinical uptake, what point it will reach at the end of the project and what happens next. So if you're not thinking in terms of that pathway and you're doing a more exploratory project, you probably aren't quite ready for this scheme. So next I'll kind of cover the assessment process. So for those of you who are familiar with DPFS, this will be familiar to you. There's no changes to this apart from the name. But MRC Proof of Concept has a two-stage application process. For the first stage, applicants submit a stage 1 application, which is then assigned to 2 or 3 panel members who recommend in writing whether the applicant should be invited to submit a stage 2 or not. And then at the panel meeting, the panel make a stage 1 decision that draws on the application itself and the written recommendations of those panel members. And then in the second stage, invited stage 2 applications go for external peer review, and the panel will consider both the stage 2 application and the comments of the external reviewers in reaching a final funding decision. So important to note that there is no response to peer review stage for MRC Proof of Concept. And this means that in theory, an applicant could go from first submitting to an award within around 24 to 28 weeks, which allows us to respond quickly to exciting emerging ideas and to kind of streamline that process as much as possible where potentially there's sort of competition in a space. So that's why we've tried to kind of shorten that process as much as possible. In terms of who's assessing your stage 1 applications, we have a large panel that have representatives from academia and industry, and collectively they have a lot of experience in translating research into clinical application. They have expertise in commercialization and product development, and they have broad knowledge across a wide range of scientific areas. But one thing to note is that while panel members are highly experienced, they might not be specialists in your exact field. So it's really important that a stage 1 application provides that context and explanation for both your clinical need and your proposed solution, and that you include sufficient supporting detail to make sure that the panel can kind of understand what you're trying to do. The panel have kind of 4 key assessment criteria that they look at when assessing stage 1 application. So firstly, what is the need the proposal is aiming to address? Is it significant? And does the proposed solution have a competitive advantage over other solutions? What's the rationale and supporting evidence for why the proposed solution will meet the need that's been identified? And is the level of qualification and rationale reasonable? They'll look at the deliverability of the project. So is the development plan realistic? The panel has to look at value for money because of the scope of the scheme. We fund kind of early 200-300K prototype refinement projects all the way through to potentially a phase 1 to 5 million clinical trial. So they're not looking at how expensive it is, they're looking at value for money. And then also, does the team have access to all the necessary assets to deliver the plan? So that could be expertise, equipment, clinical trial, infrastructure, etc. And then lastly, IP, I will talk a bit more in detail about later on, but they're looking to see that there's an appropriate intellectual property strategy to optimise the chance of downstream funding and partnering. So really at stage 1, what you need to do is convince the panel that there is a significant unmet need, that you have a well-supported rationale for your solution, a realistic and deliverable plan with the right team and resources, and a clear IP strategy to enable downstream funding or adoption. When the stage 1 opportunity is published on the 2nd of July, their full list of assessment areas will be available. I haven't got anything on stage 2 criteria in this webinar, but if an applicant is invited to stage 2, then we run a workshop and offer one-to-one support, and you'll also have feedback from the panel to support a stage 2 application. Okay, so next I'm going to kind of go into more detail about what the application looks like and pick out a few key sections where we see sort of common weaknesses. So there are 17 sections at stage 1, some are mandatory and some are optional, and kind of some general guidance for those preparing a proposal. Firstly, stick to the word limit and don't try and work around it. Read the questions and guidance carefully and follow kind of the recommended structure that's in the guidance. Please don't attach anything that's not asked for in the proposal questions. Anything that's unauthorised may lead to application being rejected before it reaches the panel. A good tip is to get your application proofread before submitting, because panel members will pick up on kind of spelling, grammar, inconsistencies in the text or kind of insufficient referencing. There are sections where you can embed images, data and tables, but only do that where allowed. And please don't use images to get around the word limits. Your application may be rejected if you do that. A really good tip is to check the readability of your embedded images using the read view on the funding service. So make sure that the view that the panel see, they're able to read and understand all of your included tables and figures. And then finally, referencing, applications should be wholly self-contained, so you should only be using hyperlinks to sort of reference, link to the referenced information, not to kind of provide additional detail. Okay, so this is kind of all the sections on the stage 1 application, and the ones in kind of blue I'll go through in a bit more detail today with some useful tips. So the first section on the form is related applications, and this is relevant for applicants who have been invited to resubmit a previously unsuccessful stage 1 or stage 2 proposal. And this is the space for you to address any prior panel feedback from either stage 1 or stage 2 and or peer review feedback from stage 2. So what we're really looking for in this section is meaningful engagement with the feedback. So we want you to show that you've thought carefully about what's been raised. Of course, if you disagree with a particular point, that's absolutely fine, but you should provide clear justification, ideally supported by data, rather than just saying it's not a problem, don't worry about it. Show that you kind of thought about it and that you're not concerned by that point. A good resubmission makes it easy for the panel to see what's changed. So how have you strengthened your proposal as a result of the feedback? Something we really don't want to see is a resubmission with minimal changes or that's been very dismissive of the feedback. The panel are trying to help, they're very experienced, they want to see good projects succeed. So their feedback's intended to be constructive, and the strongest applications treat it as an opportunity to improve the project. And really what the panel want to see in this section is that the issues that have been previously raised have been understood, addressed, and that you've got a kind of more robust, stronger application in response. The next two sections I've combined together because they're linked and they're important sections of the application. So that's opportunity and market and the downstream development plan. So for opportunity and market, we're looking for a clear articulation of the clinical need. What's the problem you're solving and why does it matter? And we're not just looking for a description of your solution or technology. You need to explain who it's for, who are the end users, where will it be used, And then also show awareness of the wider landscape. So what other solutions exist, both on the market and in development, and what are the advantages and limitations of those current approaches? And then what advantage does your solution offer in comparison? And we'd also expect to see some evidence of engagement with end users, which helps demonstrate that there's a real need and that your proposed solution is relevant and usable in practice. And then for the downstream development plan and route to patient benefit, this is really about looking beyond the lifetime of the MRC Proof of Concept Award. So we want to understand how this project moves you closer to patient benefit. What are the next steps after this funding? What outputs will the project generate, and how will those outputs unlock the next stage, whether that's further funding, partnering, or clinical implementation? You should also outline your intended route to market, which could be licensing or a spin out or another model, or it could not be commercialization at all, but we want to know how you're going to take this forward. We advise that you think about the regulatory pathway as early as possible and make sure that you show that you're aware of what the requirements are for your intervention downstream. And then for all of the above, we're looking at evidence of engagement. So have you had early conversations with any potential downstream funders, with the regulators, or with potential industry partners or adopters? And really importantly, all of this should be proportionate to the stage of your project. So for example, if you're at an early stage refining a prototype device, we wouldn't necessarily expect you to have it secured an industry partner, but we would expect that you've undertaken some engagement with potential end users and also have some high-level consideration of potential downstream adopters or partners. So we're just asking you in these sections to show that your project doesn't stop at the end of the MRC funding and that it's part of a longer-term thought-through pathway towards that patient impact. So next section I want to talk about is the approach section. This is the largest section of the application where you have 2,000 words to explain how you're going to deliver your project. And in this section, you need to provide an overview of your project plan, including your methodology, along with your risk management strategy and project management requirements. And there's two key features of this section where we see kind of common weaknesses. So milestones are a really important feature of the MRC Proof of Concept scheme, and these projects are milestone driven. So you must articulate at least two progression milestones, one of which will be the final project endpoint. And for each milestone, you need to provide clear go, no-go criteria. And these milestones aren't just part of the application, but they are used by MRC and the panel post-award to actively monitor progress. And the MRC can terminate projects that don't meet the defined milestone criteria, for example, if there's safety issues or underperformance of the technology. And then in this section, you're also asked to embed a Gantt chart, which shows the clear project tasks broken down into specific measurable activities with ownership of those tasks. It should also show dependencies between tasks and indicate where the milestones fall as those decision points within the timeline. And on the next slide, I've got some examples of good and poor milestones. So this is a very oversimplified slide, but just to kind of show you what a poor versus a strong proposal looks like in terms of milestones and Gantt charts. So on the slide is a kind of typical weak example where the tasks are very vague, they have no ownership shown, and the milestones of complete testing and submit a final report aren't decision points and they're not linked to the project outputs, they're just kind of activities that need completing. And a kind of approach like this makes it really difficult for the panel to assess whether the project's deliverable and whether the risks are being appropriately mitigated. So next we've got a slightly stronger example, also simplified for the purpose of today, but you can see the tasks are more clearly defined with responsibilities indicated, and more importantly, those milestones are meaningful. So they have clear thresholds and measurable criteria and a link to real go, no-go decisions. So for example, for milestone 1, if your prototype doesn't meet those safety parameters, then you're not going to progress to do all the preclinical testing. And then it's not on the slide, but those final milestone 2 criteria that are listed, we'd expect those to link to the next stage of development. So are they criteria required for late stage preclinical studies or even a clinical study? So the key takeaway from this slide is that milestones should not just describe activities, they should enable decision making and demonstrate how you are de-risking the project. Next, I want to talk about the statistical design section. So this is about giving the panel confidence that your study is appropriately designed and statistically robust. So there needs to be enough information here for the panel to understand how you've arrived at your proposed design. So you should provide sufficient detail for your calculations to be understood and replicated. And we have statisticians on the panel that will be looking at this. So that means you need to set out any sample size assumptions, expected effect sizes, variability, any key parameters you've used. If you don't include that level of detail, it's really hard for the panel to assess whether the study is appropriately powered. And then equally important as providing the numbers is that you justify your design choices. So why is this the right study design? Why are your assumptions reasonable? If possible, ground those assumptions in data. So if you've got any preliminary data or using published literature or prior studies to inform your calculations, please let the panel know where you've got that from. And what the panel are looking for is to see that your study is appropriately designed and capable of generating meaningful outputs. And we highly recommend that you have professional statistical input into this section, and that you show the panel that you've got a level of statistical support in your project. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about IP. It's an area where we often see gaps in applications, and IP is a really key component of translational research, and some people kind of try to ignore it. But what we want you to think of is IP as a tool to generate impact. It's not just about commercial return, but ultimately the MRC wants to see that there's public benefit from our investments and that innovations can be taken forward to reach patients. So in many cases, to progress a technology, you will require external investment or partnerships, and those partners will expect clarity around the IP. And without that clarity, it can be very difficult to attract follow-on funding or industry investment or engagement. So in this section, what we're looking for you to do is to clearly describe both the background IP and any new IP that will be generated throughout the proof of concept project, and be explicit about who owns that, including if it lies within your institution or with any collaborators or third parties. And where IP is shared or externally owned, you need to show that it will be accessible for the purposes of the project with appropriate agreements in place or planned. It's really important and a common error to assume that IP is just patents, but you should consider a broad range of assets. This could be know-how, databases, algorithms, copyright, design rights. Make sure you kind of look across the piece at potential IP. And then IP management should be an ongoing process. So another common misconception is that once you have a patent, that you're done and your IP is protected. But actually, you should be reviewing and developing IP throughout the project and putting new protections in place as appropriate as you go through. So we're looking for a clear plan for how that new IP will be identified and protected, and how existing IP will be managed. As with other sections, our expectations are proportionate to the stage of development. So if you're very early in your development pathway, we're not expecting lots of patents and fully developed commercialization plans, but we do expect that you've engaged with your technology transfer office and you have a clear understanding of your IP position. I'll talk about the industry collaboration framework next, and you don't need to complete the ICF question at stage 1, but this is the place in the proposal to describe any planned industry collaborations or partnerships and how you'll handle IP within those. And what the panel are really looking for with this section is confidence that IP is being actively considered and managed in a way that will support downstream development and ultimately that patient benefit and impact that we want to see from our funding. So I've included a slide on the ICF. It's important to note there's no question. The question set for ICF are at stage 1, but you should review the framework before submitting a stage 1 application, and use the IP section and the letters of support section to put some initial detail in about any planned collaborations with industry. So this framework's still useful even before you invite to stage 2 and have to fill in the kind of formal question set. If you think the ICF will apply to your stage 1 proposal, please put ICF at the start of your application title. It's just an indication, and if it becomes apparent that it's not an ICF application, then we're not holding you to that, but it just gives us an idea at stage 1 if you think you need to apply under the framework. So the ICF supports applicants by helping to ensure that necessary discussions have been initiated with your industry partners, and that the nature of the collaboration is compliant with MRC guidelines and funding requirements. And what we're really looking for as MRC is to be satisfied that the research is academically led and that the project constitutes appropriate use of UK public funds. Something else there is lots of industry partnerships don't need to be considered under the ICF, and there is a really helpful decision tree on the link that will help you determine the type of collaboration that does need to be under the ICF. And then the key takeaways for someone considering a stage 1 application is to speak to your translational research office or us at the MRC early if you have an industry partner and you think it might apply, just to clarify whether the arrangements are appropriate. And also don't be put off by this framework. It's there to help you, and it's there to help you have those discussions with your potential industry partners. And then the last thing to say, another common misconception, is that you need to have an industry partner to be successful. In MRC Proof of Concept, it's absolutely not a prerequisite that you have industry partners, and actually the wrong partnership can be worse than not having an industry partner on board. So make sure that your collaborators are really valuable and bringing something to the project. So now I'm just going to go through some kind of general application tips that kind of summarises everything I've talked about so far. So we want you to be clear on the unmet clinical need, and the why is just as important as your what. And a good application will show how your solution addresses that need and also where your project sits on the pathway to patients. And it should be really clear what comes next after the MRC project. Having the right team is really important. This goes beyond just scientific expertise, so you should be thinking about clinical input, statistics, project management, end users and patients where relevant, and make sure you have all the expertise available to deliver the project. And then in terms of the plan, we want to see a robust and realistic plan. We're looking for meaningful, measurable milestones that are linked to clear no-go decision-making points. You should consider your route to market and identify potential downstream partners and commercialization routes early, just so it will help inform your planning and make sure that you're collecting the right kind of data that downstream partners want to see. And then finally, make use of the support available, including using institutional expertise such as technology transfer officers, translational research officers, colleagues who hold awards, and there's a lot of guidance materials which I've included at the end of the presentation as well. So use all of that as you're preparing an application. This slide reflects some of the most common reasons applications aren't competitive at stage 1. So in terms of the plan, there's no limit, as I said at the start, to the cost or duration of these awards, obviously within reason of the overall scheme budget. So you should ask for what you need in terms of both time and cost. And we'd much rather see a well-justified, realistic plan than something that is underscoped or overly ambitious. Similarly, being realistic about timings, so things like ethic approvals, manufacturing, clinical site setup, often take longer than expected. So again, utilize expertise around how long those things can take and ask for the time that you need. In terms of writing for your audience, clarity is really important at stage 1. As I said before, there's no external peer review, so you need to write for that broader scientific audience. And if you're making the panel work really hard to understand the need, your approach, or your data, that's going to give you a disadvantage in the assessment. So spell it out for them. And then in terms of the wider programme strategy, we sometimes see gaps. So, for example, not addressing competing solutions. So if you neglect to mention a competing solution that's on the market or in development, the panel will find out and they'll have a big question mark as to why you've neglected to mention that in your application, and it might kind of weaken their confidence in your solution. Similarly, not considering freedom to operate or IP risks can also raise concerns about downstream viability of the project, and again, that sort of lack of description or clarity on the downstream development pathway. And then lastly, please don't rush an application. From next year, we'll be going back to 3 deadlines a year, so come in when you're ready. And it's really important, as I said before, to engage with your internal services. And we've added timely to the slide because consulting your translational research office 24 hours before the deadline is not going to mean that they can provide sort of meaningful guidance. So make sure you're talking to them early and getting their guidance on your application. Lastly, I'm just going to kind of cover a couple of policy updates. So first thing to note is that we have introduced a new question at stage 1 for any projects that involve the manufacture of cell and gene therapy products under GXP standards. So this will be GLP or GMP. So if this doesn't apply to your project, you don't need to worry about this question. If you're not sure if it applies, please contact the MRC team and we can advise. But we've introduced this because we're seeing a consistent theme in feedback from the panel around cell and gene therapy manufacturing. Obviously, it's challenging, can come with some risk. So we've introduced this question at both stages. It's not about the kind of detailed technical process of the manufacturing methods, but rather it's kind of your overall approach to the manufacturing. So you'll be asked to summarize the scale and intended use of the product, the quality standard it's being manufactured under, i.e. GLP, GMP, who will carry out the manufacturing if known, and any evidence that they have the appropriate expertise, capacity, and predicted timelines if available. And you'll also need to describe how batches will be validated, whether you have assays in place, and if not, how and when they will be developed. And you can also refer in this section to any regulatory expectations or advice you've received. This is an overview at stage 1. So at stage 2, there'll be much more space to provide additional detail and a risk mitigation strategy, and also attach any regulatory correspondence you've had. And as with all the other sections, this is all proportionate to the stage of development. So we're not expecting full GMP readiness at an early stage, but we do want to see that you have a plan and that you understand what's going to be required for the manufacturing. And then a couple of policies to note. So MRC is aligning with the broader UK-wide practice on managing resubmissions, and we have already introduced a no resubmission policy for our curiosity-driven applicant-led schemes. We're currently considering how this should apply to translation schemes such as MRC Proof of Concept, and we're kind of finalising the guidance for the next round now. So the definitive position on resubmissions for stage 1 will be available in the opportunity once it opens on the 2nd of July. And we are also adopting the one application as project lead policy, although that's never typically been an issue in the past because these projects are quite large and complex. So most project leads are focused on one at a time. Okay, and then lastly, before we move to the Q&A, I'll just kind of outline the timeline for the upcoming round, and then I've got a whole host of resources that hopefully will be useful. So the next stage 1 proof of concept round will open on the 2nd of July and close on the 18th of November. The written assessment will take place in December and January, and then the panel meeting itself will be on the 20th and 21st of January next year. And we would communicate the outcome as quickly as possible, and we provide feedback on all applications regardless of the result. And then the first available deadline for stage 2 is March, or you can defer to the following deadline, which is July. And as I said earlier, we're going to go back to having 3 deadlines a year from next year. This is just for information. This is all the kind of portfolio areas of the program managers if you want to get in touch with us directly. Or if you're not sure who to contact, you can use the general mailbox, which is at the top of the slide. We'll make the slides and the links included available after the webinar as well. As I said, there's a whole host of guidance and resources. I just wanted to flag a couple in particular. So there's a repurposing medicines toolkit that was developed by MRC and LifeArc, which you might want to look at if you're considering applying with a drug repurposing project. There's also some supplementary guidance for clinical test development for DPFS, now proof of concept. And then we're currently working on some kind of additional guidance for applicants developing software and AI, but there is some interim UKRI guidance and also some NHS guidance, which is useful if you're operating that space. And then this slide is just all the general guidance for using TFS, what the different roles are in an application form, the ICF, so useful guidance there. And I'll stop talking now so that we can move on and have as much time as possible for Q&A. And I'll hand over to Claire to chair the Q&A session and hopefully stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Sophie. And Sophie will be here along with Deanna and Adam to answer these questions. Just because we've had a few questions around the name updates, just to clarify that GAP Fund or DPGF will now be called Impact Acceleration Awards, and Impact acceleration and the impact acceleration accounts were the previously IAAs and confidence in concept. So it's just a name change. The funding opportunities will remain the same. So we've had a few questions around sort of different examples. So for technologies currently at TRL, could you clarify how we would expect teams to demonstrate a clinical unmet need at an early stage of development? And would it be acceptable for the technology to be positioned primarily as a lab research tool, or does it need to be intended for clinical use and demonstrate a clear medical benefit? Sophie or Adam, would you be happy to answer that?
Yeah, so the tool or technology can be used as a tool to develop other interventions. So it might not be a clinically applied tool, but it does have to have a medical or a clinical need sort of downstream that it's supporting, if that makes sense. So it might not be clinically like used in the clinic, but it should have a medical need associated with the use of it. So it could be something like drug development, like it could be a new screening tool, for example, for drug development. So that tool itself might not be clinically regulatory applied in the clinic, but is used to streamline the downstream drug development for a particular need. I don't know if you want to add anything, Adam, if that answers the question.
I think that answers it nicely, but just to sort of add some of the comments that Sophie made within the presentation itself, that you need to be engaging with the end users for technologies such as this, and you need to show that there's a clear need. So one of the main areas of feedback for these kind of tools and technologies that enable improvements in the drug discovery or therapeutic process is that no one's demonstrated that anyone will actually purchase it, that anyone actually wants it, and that it will actually improve what's maybe already been built in-house within large pharma or medium-sized biotech. So you need to be able to demonstrate that utility when you are making those, and to demonstrate that it will have uptake and what your commercial plan is for uptake. So there's a couple of commercial plans. You can either be acting as a service provider, or you can be looking to license your technology, but you'll need to define what your route to actually getting that technology out there to actually improve those processes is.
Thanks, Sophie and Adam. There was a question around the remit. Is device testing for therapeutic interventions for diseases within remit? Deanna or Sophie, are you happy to come in on that one?
I think yes, because again, it's supporting decision making, but it has to be you have to provide preliminary data and show that with patient benefit.
Thanks, Deanna. Does the fund or grant cover IP applications and IP maintenance costs?
So there is kind of block grants that are given to institutions to cover things like patent filing costs. So we wouldn't cover kind of IP related patent filing costs within the proof of concept application. Your institution should have separate kind of pot of money for that. So no, but we would expect you to have spoken to your tech transfer office about that and to have the appropriate level of guidance for the stage of development in terms of how detailed your FTO search is, or whether you're ready to file a patent or what you need. So yeah, we don't cover IP filing costs within proof of concept applications.
Thanks, Sophie. We've been asked if we could speak a bit about academic applications with a startup, so pre-commercial technology, and a commercial partner in the picture, how that might fit within sort of remit and how they could work together.
Yes, so definitely go and look at the industry collaboration framework in detail. We do see applications where there's sort of a spin out established as a potential tool to take something forward, but at the proof of concept stage, we wouldn't expect you to have kind of pre-agreed exclusive access for any IP to a commercial partner, because that might clash with our subsidy control legislation that we have to follow. So it can be a route to downstream, and the panel do like to see that is perhaps a option that you're considering, but it shouldn't have any kind of pre-negotiated exclusive access to the IP generated to that commercial partner. If they are going to co-own any IP, then again, in the industry collaboration framework, there's a minimum expectation of kind of a financial contribution in kind or cash from that partner. So I would definitely advise looking at the framework, but it can be a positive for the panel to see that you have a downstream route. Again, depending on the stage of development, if you're quite late stage, that might be the next step. So it could be really important for your project to have that commercial partner on board ready to take forward the outputs. But we just have to make sure that it follows our kind of guidelines to make sure that we can make an award. So I would advise you to check the framework and also contact us if you're considering an application where that's the scenario, and we can kind of talk through the details with you.
Thanks, Sophie. Is in vivo efficacy testing of a lead antibody for a target disease and in vitro efficacy testing, which will eventually lead to phase 1/2 trial, be within remit of MRC Proof of Concept scheme?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thanks, Sophie. In terms of hardware, does it make any difference to propose to create a tool from scratch or to use an off-the-shelf solution?
Deanna, that's sort of your portfolio, but do you want to have a go at that one?
I mean, you can, if you propose to develop a tool from scratch, you can do that, but again, you have to provide us the data you have already. As well as Sophie mentioned earlier, if you're not sure on remit, or if you fit with DPFS with us, you can email us with more details on the project, and we will be able to help you, guide you.
I mean, just to add to that, obviously there are benefits when you are buying something off the shelf, that it can often be optimized, but it may not always be developed perfectly for the solution you want. Also, you need to then be aware that might have intellectual property in itself, so you would then need to provide a clear picture of where your freedom to operate is, how your IP plan is, if you're going to incorporate someone else's technology in your wider technological solution.
Thanks, Adam and Deanna. We've had a question about LifeArc providing applicants support for stage 2 bids, and I would ask you to contact LifeArc in the first instance for LifeArc funding, but we can co-fund potentially with charity partners for the translation funding schemes. There's a question about smaller institutions not necessarily having block grants or internal money for IP sort of filing costs. What would be our advice to them?
I mean, as part of these awards, that you do need to demonstrate that you have the mechanisms to appropriately protect the intellectual property developed during the funding of these awards, to sort of.
No, it's just it's recorded, so I can look at it later. So I received an email from Nick. Is this what you?
Sorry about that. I think we enabled the microphone so that people could ask questions. Yeah, I mean, we appreciate that these costs can be inhibitory, but if you have, I mean, we assign all the intellectual property that's generated as part of this funding to the research organisation that we award the grant. therefore you need to be able to demonstrate that you have appropriate mechanisms and appropriate funding in order to protect that sufficiently in order to move the technology forward. If you can't provide that reassurance that you have mechanisms to protect the technology, then it makes it very difficult for you then to get to the next stage where you might want to partner or out-license or sell any intellectual property that you developed. So it is something that you will need to think of carefully. But just because the Research England block grants maybe doesn't come to you doesn't mean that there won't be provisions within your university for actually protecting intellectual property that's developed within the university.
Great, thank you. Been asked about any rules on who can lead, for example, a postdoc, or does it need to be an already established PI? And maybe we could sort of give some advice on a team.
Yep. So absolutely, if a postdoc is kind of really driving the development of a technology, perhaps they've already done some work on it in their PhD, then we would definitely expect them, and they are very capable of being the project lead, but they should have appropriate additional support in the team. So we would expect to see someone perhaps with that expertise in the downstream development or statistical expertise, clinical trial design input, as I mentioned, kind of all those areas that are needed to deliver the project. So we can support earlier career researchers as project leads, but we would expect to see that there's appropriate kind of breadth of support within the core team. The proof of concept team doesn't offer the new investigator grant as currently stands because of the nature of these kind of needing a large kind of collaborative group to take these projects forward, but we have and do support kind of earlier career researchers as the lead for these projects as well.
Great, thanks, Sophie. We've been asked if those employed by the NHS can apply for proof of concept awards.
Yes, if your organisation is eligible for MRC funding, then yes, which I think includes most NHS organisations.
Great, thanks. Just bear with me while I'm scrolling down the questions. Yeah, so there's a question about, so for projects that were unsuccessful in the last open DPFS round, so November 2025 submissions, how and when will it be determined whether or not they are invited, they can sort of resubmit? So this will be before the new resubmission policy is in place. Is there some advice on sort of what applicants should be doing in their sort of resubmission?
So the resubmission policy applies from the 1st of April this year. So any applications that have been previously declined prior to that date, the policy won't apply to those previous applications. So you can come back in with a new submission. If you have been unsuccessful with a proof of concept award submission previously, then we would still expect that you address the feedback in any resubmission that comes back through in the next round. But be aware that the policy will apply from 1st of April. So any submissions to the next round, we are still finalising what the kind of process for inviting resubmissions will be for the scheme. And that information will all be available when the opportunity is launched on the 2nd. So we'll make that clear.
Great, thanks. And Adam, you've touched on end users, but we've had a question about whether this is expected during application development to sort of inform the application or programme, or can it be included as work during the proof of concept award?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Clarissa, for bringing this back to the top. Basically, there is no hard and fast rule on the level of engagement. But as Sophie's gone through, the strength of the application is often that you can demonstrate that there is a user base and that it is a solution that's actually wanted. And quite often, one of our previous chairs quite often said, you know, this is a great solution, but it's not one that I need or want. So that engagement with the end users is around finding out what actually the clinicians or the patient groups actually want. So it will help strengthen and drive the quality of your application. It's not, you know, something that we mandate, but it's something that we point you towards, unless you know actually what you're trying to solve and that people actually want you to solve it, it makes it very difficult to write a compelling application.
Just to add that you can build in some of that engagement work into your proposal. So you might have had some early kind of not quantitative conversations with those end users. And if you're at a quite early stage, you could build some of that work also into your proposal as well. But I think the panel still want to see that there is a need when you're coming in. So again, it's appropriate to the stage of development. So if you're quite late stage, we'd expect you to have done quite significant engagement with end users. If you're quite early and you're refining a prototype, it might be more informal, but we would want to see some evidence that you are doing that, and that you're building that into your kind of downstream plan as well.
So had a question about advice on best practice for IP strategy and global health interventions developed with overseas research units, especially where the aim is sort of equitable global access.
Yeah, I mean, in relation to IP, there's obviously, if you have multiple partners, it's best practice to actually establish who might lead on taking charge of that and taking charge of the onward development. It can get quite complex if you're in multiple territories with multiple people, and it's all kind of feeding into a pot and everybody has an expectation of being able to take everything forward. So whilst we wouldn't monitor any of those agreements between academic partners per se, the panel will expect to have a look to see that there is an appropriate IP management and IP onward development strategy, and part of that will be coming to an agreement between the various host institutions, whether they be purely UK based or international, on how that will be taken forward and who will take primary lead on taking that forward.
Thanks, Adam. Is there a limitation on how many applications a research group or institute can submit to the same round?
There's no limits on kind of a research institute. I think I put on the slide that you can only submit one application as project lead. Again, with these types of programs, they're quite intensive in terms of workloads, and so I guess if there was a particular, if someone was on lots and lots of different applications, that is about the proportion of time that you're dedicating to the project being appropriate. So there's no limit from research institutions widely. There is a limit on who can be the project lead. I don't think we've ever really seen it as an issue in proof of concept or DPFS, because most applicants kind of are quite wholly focused on their kind of technology that they're driving forward.
Thanks, Sophie. And we've had a sort of question around what our definition is of an end user with engagement. So can that be members of the public as well as clinicians?
Yeah, whoever's most appropriate, whoever your technology is aimed at. So if it's something that you're expecting members of the public to adopt, then absolutely. If you're developing a surgical tool, then you'd expect that to be clinicians. So yeah, it just depends on the kind of intended use of your intervention technology and then the appropriate end user. So yeah, it can be public.
Thanks, Sophie. What would we expect to see in terms of evidence of engagement with partners? So would that be a letter or statement of support, or is it sufficient to state that they've engaged with the partners?
So the rules around on the application form for engagement with partners, so you shouldn't be uploading letters of support unless they're from a project partner. So at stage 1, just sort of saying that you have engaged with the end user and this is what they've said would be sufficient. And then at stage 2, the panel might delve into that a bit more and ask to see more supporting statements. But the kind of application form asks that you only upload letters of support from project partners. So then you can just detail in the application what engagement you've undertaken and what the outcomes of that were, and yeah, that will be sufficient at stage 1.
Sophie, can a research associate serve as the sole principal investigator on a pre-licensing stage project, and what specific data should be demonstrated to prove the translation readiness?
I mean, as Sophie's touched on earlier, we don't have any restrictions on who can lead the project, but obviously the scale of some of these projects where they can be anything from 200k to 5 million, the panel will be looking that the appropriate expertise exists in the lead and then the support underneath that lead from the wider project team in order to deliver some of those things. What was the second part? Sorry, Claire, that question.
And what sort of data is required to sort of prove the translation readiness?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that's a kind of project by project conversation that would need to be had. What we would expect is, you know, if you look at yourself as a member of the panel, is there enough information there to give you the confidence in the scale and scope of what you're requesting, and are the milestones appropriately set up that any risk associated with that development is adequately covered within the proposal?
Thanks, Adam. Is matched funding from the host RO, is our view that it's better presented as cash or in-kind support, and how does the panel view its value in strengthening the application?
It's not something we request as part of UKRI. We are committed to full economic costing, and we will cover the costs related to delivery of the development of that product, obviously excluding the intellectual property protection costs that are covered by other things. So, you know, you should detail the full cost of delivering the project to us, and then we can take a decision on whether that reflects value for money to move things forward.
Adam, for technologies that have both national and global opportunities, sort of how much emphasis is placed on what geography it might serve, and are the panel looking for sort of national value or more sort of global reach?
I think as long as there's a clinical need, it doesn't have to be UK patients that benefit. If the need is global, or if the need is in another population, then we are still willing to support applications that target those populations. As Adam said earlier, MRC doesn't take ownership of any IP, so what we want these interventions to benefit patients. So yeah, if you can make a case for why the target population or the route to kind of ultimately making it available globally is in a different setting, then the panel will consider that.
And I think what the panel would want to see is you deciding which way you want to go, because obviously that defines what your development route looks like. So if you're going to purely develop it for a global scenario, then you might need to construct your pathway in a certain way. If it's going to be rolled out into a UK setting with maybe quite a big base of patients, and then the utility will roll out across the global, that's obviously a different development pathway. So establishing how you want to get this to patients is one of those key criteria.
Thanks, Adam. Would it be appropriate to cost work packages on safety and toxicology for a new intervention? Would this be within remit for MRC proof of concept?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, anything from early prototype development through to early clinical trials. So yeah, we would absolutely cover safety, tox, kind of preclinical studies.
Deanna, maybe one for you. Do you need to submit a SOCUP form?
If your work will be with involving NHS, then yes. But not for stage 1 application. You don't need to do that for stage 1 application. It's only for invited stage 2 application.
Thanks, Deanna. Are market evaluation and analysis costs eligible under the funding opportunity where they're used to assess demand, adoption, and route to market rather than to generate core research data?
Yeah, we do fund health economic evaluation, again, proportionate to the stage of the project. So the panel will look to see that those costs are justified and appropriate for the development. But yes, absolutely, we do cover things like kind of that market demand assessment. You just need to justify how it will be used and why it's important to do it as part of the proof of concept project that you're putting forward.
Thanks, Sophie. I've just seen a comment that says from somebody who says their question is missed. If you're happy to copy and paste it back into the top, because my Q&A keeps scrolling back to the top as soon as there's a new question. They're coming in faster than I can scroll down. That would be great.
I think, Claire, you can filter by most upvoted as well, if that helps.
Okay,
but yeah,
great.
there are new
Thanks,
ones coming in.
If there is widely publicised need for drug discovery in an area, can you reference the published work, or do you need direct interaction with potential end users, for example, industry, to justify the end user requirement?
If there's sort of supporting evidence of end user need doesn't necessarily have to come directly from the team. If there is kind of published literature available to support that, again, I think if you're much later stage in looking to kind of do the final de-risking before industry involvement, we would still expect you to have had some conversations with industry. So again, it's dependent on where you are in that development pathway as to how much engagement you and your team should have had. If there's published evidence out there for a need, that is also can be sufficient kind of evidence of the need or from the end users.
Great, thanks. And Deanna, you might want to come in on this one. How much sort of budget detail needs to go into the stage 1 application?
It's only like total funding required, and there will be like a section for the funder contribution, and that's it. Not as much. On the stage 2 application, you will be required to provide a detailed breakdown of costs.
Deanna, we've had a question around sort of clarifying the IP position for the investigator, the funder, and a third additional party, for example, a charity. And who would the IP belong to, and how would the ownership affect future probability of the output?
MRC as the funder don't own any rights to the IP of the projects we support. Some charities do have reach through to IP. That would need to be clarified with them. And then, but we would expect in most cases the IP would lie with the host institution and be managed by them. If it's a complex case, we're very happy to talk to you about what the proposed arrangements are to make sure they align. I think what the panel are looking for with any kind of external IP ownership or access to sort of joint IP is that there is still a viable route to take it forward. So if you've got a company partner who owns some background IP, the panel want to see that you have access not just for the project, but that there will be a route forward beyond that, and that the partner is on board and willing to license or sell that IP to you downstream. So if there's any reach through of funders, it's just about understanding that you still will have a route forward beyond the MRC funding. But yeah, we don't take any ownership of any IP from the MRC side as the funder. Different scenarios depending on who your partners and other co-funders are.
Sophie, we've had a question from someone who's had a DPFS award, but they say they're sort of in an area where they don't necessarily have enough sort of patience for the next step, but have proof of confidence to provide the confidence to follow on funding. Would this scheme be appropriate?
Yes, potentially. So as I said at the start, we do support sequential awards where it's necessary to appropriately de-risk something for that future investment. So if you have some proof of concept data, but perhaps not sufficient powered efficacy study that a downstream partner might need, then we would consider, as long as it's within the scope of up to phase 2A, that we would consider a follow-on proof of concept application if the need is justified to further de-risk.
Thanks, Sophie. Deanna, are academics eligible to lead for this funding opportunity, or must the lead come from sort of a clinician?
Yes, sure, academics are eligible to lead the project.
can some of the funding go to partners outside of the UK, for example, Europe?
Yes, yeah. We have some kind of UK-wide guidance on costs associated with international partners, but yes, not the whole team doesn't have to be UK based. The lead RO does.
We have a question around the EU AI Act, saying that it's made development of software medical device-based trials challenging. Would this funding be suitable to fill the gap to meet the higher entry level into the EU?
Yeah, so I guess if your market is in the EU and those are the regulatory requirements that you need to meet in order to reach your ultimate end users or market, then yes, we would expect you to be doing the required work in a proof of concept project that would enable you to access that market. So we would expect you to do the work required by the regulators in the area you're targeting with your ultimate once it reaches patients. So if that act requires a certain level of qualification to be done, and then we would fund that work.
Sophie, what are the typical number of milestones that we would expect to see in an application?
Do you want to take that one, Deanna?
Yeah, I mean, it depends from project to project, but we do not expect you to put too many milestones, but as many as required for your project.
Yeah, so a minimum of 2. One would be the endpoint. If you've got a sort of long 5-year big clinical trial, I would say 2 is probably not sufficient. And you just need to think about those points where there is a go, no-go decision that needs to be made. Yeah, as Deanna said, not too many milestones, because it becomes they aren't necessarily linked then to that really critical decision point. So it depends on the length of the project. Typically 3, maybe 4, sometimes as low as 2 if it's just a 24-month early stage project. It does depend on where the risks are in your program, and yeah, we would say commonly if you're coming in with 6 or 7 milestones, that's probably too many, and you've probably not thought about where those points are carefully enough.
And a couple more questions for clarification around MRC Proof of Concept, the IAA previously GAP Fund, and the previous MRC Confidence in Concept.
Do you mean the names? Clarification on the names?
Yeah, and what the sort of distinction is between the different funding opportunities.
Yeah, so there is more information on the remits of those other schemes online, but essentially Impact Accelerator Awards, or GAP Fund, is a single kind of experiment or a single set of experiments addressing a critical question. So they're very focused, they're much shorter, up to 18 months and up to 300k, and it's about kind of that high risk, high reward. Like if we answer this question, that will tell us if our solution really is viable to go in for a larger funding application or kind of downstream investment. The Impact Accelerator accounts or Confidence in Concept are smaller again, and universities do use them differently, so it might depend on your institution, but they're designed to be flexible to kind of support researchers with that early sort of proof of concept for translation. So generating some kind of very early data to suggest that it could be a solution to take forward and translate. And then, is that the schemes that you asked about? GAP Fund, IAA? I think that was it.
Thanks, Sophie. Are academics able to negotiate a share in IP?
So intellectual property, as part of all these, resides with the research organisation who the lead applicant is from. A lot of those research organisations will have award to inventorship schemes. So if you are named on any of the patents, copyrights, or data that's related to those, there may well be a revenue share if the university then does make any deals with anybody. But we per se, do not get involved with that. That is a negotiation between you and your employee.
In the interest of
employer.
time, employer, yeah. In the interest of time, we have come to the end of the webinar. I appreciate there are a lot of questions we didn't have time to get to today. So as I said, we will put together a document that goes through and answers anything we haven't spoken about on the webinar, and we'll also make a copy of the slides available and make sure all the links, you have access to all the links that were included in those slides, and the recording will be published as well. So hopefully there's plenty there for you to go and go back over if helpful. Thank you very much again for joining this morning. I hope it's been useful, and thank you to Claire, Deanna and Adam and Trinity for helping with the Q&A and running the webinar. And yeah, I wish you all a good rest of the week. Thank you for joining us this morning.